Coming up on Choppers Politics.
Chris, I don't think Labour need an eagle right now. I think they need a bull in a china shop. They need somebody who's going to fundamentally shake up the relationship between the country and the Labour Party.
Hello and welcome to Choppers Politics. I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent. A good week for Boris Johnson, a bad week for Sir Keir Starmer, and, well, a mixed one for Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. Her Scottish National Party won an emphatic victory in last week's elections to the Scottish Parliament, but fell just one seat short of an overall majority. But what she did get was an invitation from Prime Minister Boris Johnson to a summit to discuss how the UK can pull together after the COVID crisis and, he hopes, to keep the UK united. The Telegraph's deputy political editor, Lucy Fisher, will be joining me to discuss how Mr Johnson's government will be responding to that vote and when she thinks there might be another Scottish independence referendum. Plus, Professor Matthew Goodwin, author, academic and an expert in the so-called red wall seats, will be answering a question he put in the Sunday Times at the weekend. What is the point of the Labour Party? And let's stay with Labour, because just hours after the scale of the party's losses became clear in the elections, it emerged that frontbencher Khalid Mahmood had quit, calling for his party to listen more to the voters and less to, and I quote, a London-based bourgeoisie, with the support of brigades of social media warriors. And he joins me now on Choppers Politics to explain why. Khalid Mahmood, MP for Parry Barr and former Shadow Defence Minister, welcome to Choppers Politics. So how was your weekend?
Good, thank you. But a lot of hard work and a lot of pain, I suppose, because we didn't get the results that we wanted in the election campaign. Although in the West Midlands, we lost the mayoral, but we managed to get the PCC, Police Crime Commissioners elections through, and we had a victory on that. So I suppose some of it came through. In Birmingham, we didn't have local election. We have them next year. And so I suppose from that point of view, it was a bit hard, but we got through it.
And the news emerged that you'd also resigned from Labour's front bench. Now, that was seen to be in protest at the Labour's poor performance in some of the votes nationally, but that wasn't quite the case, was it?
No, I'd resigned on the 13th of April, but unfortunately nobody picked it up then. But everybody picked it up later on, I suppose, and linked the two together. No, my issue about Labour's position has been a long-standing one, particularly about looking at how we work together with all of our people and all of our constituents together, and not just to divide them in different identities and different cultures and different people. All of our communities work together, live together, and they all have to go out to work and they all have to rely on each other for the services that they get.
And do you think that you can do that better? You can bring communities together better from the backbenches than the front bench?
Yes, I do. And because it gives me more time to be able to go out and do some of that work. And I think it's important that we do. It's important that we engage with people who not necessarily are with us on Twitter or social media. What we want to do is be able to door knock some of those people, go and speak to their places of work and get them engaged in what the Labour Party is about. Those are the people who are the core of the Labour Party, the people who have to earn a living, people who have to go out, whether it's working in stacking shelves in supermarkets, warehouses, working in factories, working out on the roads, working wherever in transport, in driving buses or taxis. Those are the people we need to actually get back to and speak to them and say to them that you're part of us and we're here to support you.
Exactly. And do you think in any sense that Labour is going through a degree of an existential crisis? It's torn between the group you're talking about, who you know in Parry Barr in the West Midlands, and these kind of keyboard warriors on Twitter who get all fired up about the culture wars. I mean, there's a problem there. There's two different groups there, aren't there?
Well, there is, but I think what we have to do is look at the reality of the people that we represent, the people on the ground. Most of these people don't earn more than £30,000. Some of them are lucky indeed to be earning £30,000. They have to struggle. They have to struggle with their children. They have to struggle and budget for their shopping. And some of them will have to end up resorting to, food banks, let alone trying to have a battle with somebody on social media. And so therefore, those people have real lives. that we have to work with. We have to understand and see how they adjust and cope with that. And that's where we should be, looking after their interests and supporting them.
Do you feel sorry for Keir Starmer? I mean, he's had a difficult year as opposition leader. He took charge in a pandemic. He's never spoken to a conference of your members and even MPs in any large group. It's very hard to make an impact, isn't it?
Well, it's been extremely difficult as a new leader coming in and having nothing but video conferencing to speak on. And you don't, first of all, get the feel of what the people are thinking of you, how you're delivering what you're saying. And when you're in a gathering, when people are there, you can actually feel the atmosphere. So that gives you a better way of engaging with the people. On videos, it's very difficult to do that sort of stuff, although Keir's tried very hard to do that. He's done very well at question time.
Yep.
He's been able to take Boris to task. And so he's done some good stuff. But now what we need is for it to come out and actually go and engage with those communities face to face and have some real strategy to support them.
Do you think there might be a leadership challenge against Keir Starmer before the next election, which could be 2023, 2024?
I don't think so. I honestly don't think there'll be a leadership challenge for Keir. I think what the party wants to do is to actually start to get back to look at why we've lost these people's support, and what we want to do is start to get that back, and not to have internal party machinations. Whenever we've had these sort of machinations in the party, our people have suffered. At the end, the whole objective of the Labour Party is support those who are least able to support themselves and help them, put policies in to support their children, put policies in to support and give them the rightful wage that they deserve. And that's what we should be doing rather than bickering amongst ourselves.
Yeah, but that's a good wish list there, but it hasn't happened yet. Was he wrong to try and fire Angela Rayner, a Northern MP? Obviously, couldn't get rid of her because she's the elected deputy chairman, so gave her a different role. Reshuffle was meant to confer authority on the leader, and that hasn't appeared to happen so far.
Well, look, I think these sort of things are best done when you've cooled down. And I think making hasty decisions like this aren't always helpful. And I think what we need to now is a period of calm to sit back and not look at individuals, but look at how we're going to go out there and speak to the people who can vote for us, who want to vote for us, and who we should be working with. And that's what we should be doing rather than looking at moving our chairs on the deck. And we don't need to be doing that.
Are you confident he'll fight the next general election, Keir Starmer?
I think very much so. I think he will go out there and he will fight the election. I think, as I say, there's no real appetite for a leadership election. I think most of us, what we want to do is go out there and build on those constituencies, where there is no Labour representation at the moment, and get them elected. I think all of us realise the only way that we represent those people is if you have a majority in the Commons, and we need to go out there and work and not get into infighting of personalities.
What's your position on contested sculpture, contested statues and art? Do you think they should be pulled down and tipped into Bristol Harbour or somewhere, or just got rid of or hidden, or should they be explained? I
think they should be explained. I think, look, everywhere, whatever the history is, you can't just wish that away. You have to accept the history, you have to explain the history, and you have to then move forward on that. As an empire, we did things perhaps not all of which we're proud of. And it was a different environment. We did those things, and we have to explain that. And also we have to explain where we are now. At the end of the day, we live in the United Kingdom. I came to this country at the age of 10 to join my father, who was there in 1949. And I have become a member of parliament. So, what we have to understand is what this country and the laws of this country allow us to do. And that's much more powerful than looking at trying to erase some of the history. We don't need to do that.
And that's hardly helping out those people who you're talking about, the people, who are Labour's core support, working in factories and on lower incomes. It doesn't help them rowing about culture, does it?
Absolutely. I mean, it doesn't help them. They've got some of the people who are in the worst positions. We got people who are working, still having to go to food banks. We got nurses who are working, still having to go to food banks. I've had food banks in my constituency, and I have had huge queues right down the street when some of these food banks have been going. This is not the United Kingdom. This is not the Britain that I want to see in this day and age. And that what we want to be able to see is having proper respect for all of them, proper environment for people to live in, and proper facilities and food and no child poverty in this day and age. We shouldn't be having this. We've got to look at how we support them and to move forward on that.
We've got Professor Matthew Goodwin on this podcast from Kent University. He wrote a piece in the Sunday Times the weekend called "What's the Point of the Labour Party?" because the issue of class has really broken down. So he argues that the Labour Party has lost its low-income votes as the Tories. It's barely performing well in Scotland, and there are fears it's being squeezed by the Greens. Did you worry about the existential threat to the Labour Party?
Well, there is no existential threat to the Labour Party. Labour Party is of the working people. Anybody who has to earn a living by going to a place of work is the person that we should be representing, is the person that we should be supporting. Their terms and conditions at work we should be supporting. We should be supporting them to have a better environment. Whilst they're working, we should be able to support their families, their children in education, their parents and the elderly in health. The Labour Party will never be surplus to requirement. The Labour Party has a cohort. It has a cohort of people who have to try and make their life better than what it is. And that will continue to happen.
Some young people in cities might say they are left-wing and they care about identity politics. They often describe themselves as working class. Should they go to a different party? And which would that be? I can't think of one.
No, I don't think they should go to a different party. I think what they need to understand is the heritage of Labour. I think they also need to understand the history. It's not saying that was wrong or whatever happened. What happened as part of evolution of our history. And you can't, as I said before, you can't erase that. You have to come to terms with it. You have to understand it. And you have to then accept that and move forward. You can't, bits you don't like, you can't just erase.
Do you think this country is racist, Khalid Mahmood?
Generally, no. I came no, I'll tell you this. I got selected in Barr in 2001. It was majority white constituency. And I'll just very quickly say this. There was a theory going around that Khalid Mahmood's not going to get elected in Barr because there are too many Indians who don't like Kashmiris. There's too many black people who don't like an Asian. And there's too many white people who are racist who are not going to elect him. And I ended up with a 7,000 majority on my first election, and it's gone to 15 and 18,000 since then. And that is what people perceive. People are not racist. We've had a lot of colleagues being elected in predominantly white areas and who have done very well. So that shows the infrastructure of the country, the people at heart are not racist. Nusrat Ghani from the Conservative Party, who comes exactly from the same village that I do, from my parents came from. And she got elected in Wilden. And she came first on the primaries system that was done. And she's been a good member of parliament for there. And that just proves the so-called racist attitude. I think some of us fear that, but in practice, it's not true.
That's very good to hear. The Sewell report was not well received by the left at all, was it? Because it said that Britain was not institutionally racist, but it said there were issues in parts of the country. I mean, you would advise to steer clear of that in terms of politics because it doesn't help bind communities together.
I think this is what we've got to get away from. For too long now, there were issues in the 70s and the 60s in terms of racism, and we shouldn't still be harking at that level. We've got to move forward. There's a two-way street here. We've got to look at providing better services for those communities from the ethnic minorities who need additional support with their children's education, who need support with them being able to gain employment. When we have a council estate and an ethnic minority community, both communities suffer equally. And what we need to do is support all those people at that level. That's what we've got to get to. And not divide people, not divide funding. And that's what segregates people. And that's what causes these sort of issues.
What are your plans now, Khalid Mahmood, for the next few years? Now you're off the front bench. You'll be doing more street campaigning, I suppose, at weekends.
Well, I certainly will be. And what I want to be able to do is look at the issue, certainly in the Muslim community post 9/11 and 7/7. And we're still facing a significant amount of increase of young people being groomed towards radicalization. And I think that's one of the key things also that I want to look at. Because really it should have been dealt with, but we've got too many people still, again, those people on social media who are segregating our young people from the mainstream. And I've got to look to see how we can sort of start to get the Muslim community, particularly young, back onto the mainstream and see how we can play a better role in a united community and society that we should be living in.
Well, Khalid Mahmood, the best of luck with that excellent work. And thanks for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
Right, don't go anywhere. In just one moment, I'll be back with Professor Matthew Goodwin and our own Lucy Fisher to answer two of the big questions in Westminster this week. What's the point of the Labour Party? And how can Boris Johnson save the Union? Right after this.
Hi listeners, it's Barney Gordon here, popping into this podcast to tell you all about another Telegraph series called Bryony Gordon's Mad World. It's a podcast in which I chat to household names and unsung heroes about their mental health, from Stacey Solomon to therapists and doctors on the front line. We talk about looking after ourselves as we heave ourselves out of lockdown and remind you that it's totally normal to feel weird. Search Mad World wherever you usually download your podcasts.
And we're back. Now, we love the big questions here on Choppers Politics. What's the future of the newly christened Blue Wall? What's the role of fringe parties in British politics? And when will I be back in the Red Lion? But following the elections last week, Professor Matthew Goodwin has posed another one to get our teeth stuck into. What's the point of the Labour Party? And I couldn't resist the chance to potentially answer that question, so I called up Matthew myself to get his thoughts on that question which has emerged since the elections last week. Matthew Goodwin, Professor of Politics at Kent University, welcome to Choppers Politics. Great to have you on.
Thanks for having me again, Chris.
You had a brilliant piece at the weekend in the Sunday Times. What's the point of the Labour Party? Perhaps you might summarise that in 1 minute.
The Labour Party was founded for a world when the foundations of politics were economic and increasingly the foundations of politics are cultural, and the Labour Party is really only speaking to one side of that divide, and that side is quite small actually in terms of the wider country, and that's why Labour is suffering many defeats like its counterparts across much of Europe.
Is it cultural though? Because do you think that these culture wars actually matter to the two people in Hartlepool? That a row about a statue is a problem, or other offences perceived on Twitter? Are those what matters to people out in Hartlepool?
But it's interesting that I say culture and the instinctive reaction is, well, we're talking about culture wars on statues. When I say culture, I'm talking more about how we think about the nation, how we think about its relationship with Europe, how we think about our identity, how we think about our security, migration, all of those types of issues. And fundamentally, over the last 2 decades, the Labour Party has really fallen on the wrong side of that divide. It's become increasingly dependent upon university graduates, on Zoomers, millennials, who really concentrate in the big cities and the university towns. Now, Chris, under a first-past-the-post system, that is not a strategy that you want to pursue. Whereas the Conservatives, post-Brexit conservatism is very different from pre-Brexit conservatism. And we've seen the party really lean left on the economy, but lean right on culture. And it's really unlocked that new winning formula in British politics that you and I have been talking about, I think probably now for about 6 years. We could see this coming when we were up in the northern Labour heartlands in 2014. I remember us talking about it even then. And so we've really seen that open up.
I was in Hartlepool the week last Monday, and I was last there with Nigel Farage twice, I think, in 2015 and then 2017, I think that's right.
I think the rise of UKIP actually will be seen by future historians as quite an important moment in the evolution of British politics, because essentially what it did, against the backdrop of the weakening influence of class on British politics, is it basically cut through a lot of those Labour heartlands, further disrupting the bonds of loyalty between the working class and the Labour Party. And of course, that really cleared the way not only for Brexit, but it also cleared the way later for Theresa May and Boris Johnson.
I call this the bunting test. Now, bunting is obviously by its nature a bit ridiculous, but it also stands for something. I think in some quarters, bunting has all sorts of connotations and is patronised. But I think in a lot of the Labour communities and Conservative communities around the country, bunting is the strings that bind the community together. It matters putting flags up and Union Jacks on bunting. Do you know what I mean? Do you accept the bunting test?
Well, the one thing I'd say, Chris, is the vast majority of people feel proud of Britain and identify as British. That is clear in every single survey that we've got. But here's the interesting thing. About 13% of the country, what I would call a sort of the progressive left, do not really identify with Britain. They feel ashamed of Britain, and they really want to focus heavily on historic injustices, on things like empire and what went wrong 200 years ago. Most ordinary people don't really think like that. As Ronald Reagan once reminded Jimmy Carter, Americans don't want to wake up every day and be told that there's something wrong with America. They want to fundamentally believe in who they are and believe in the country. So when I talk about culture, that's what I'm referring to. It's that identity fault line. Are you proud of the country? Do you align yourself with the country? Do you accept that, Britain isn't perfect, but on balance, it's a force for good in the world? Or do you actually take a more pessimistic view? And that increasingly, I think, is going to come to the forefront of our politics.
What's your advice to Keir Starmer? He can't change who he is. He can't change the fact he's a Remain supporting lawyer from the metropolitan elite in North London, wherever you might say that place is. What can he do? I mean, he is now leader of the Labour Party. He's fundamentally a decent bloke. We accept that. He has a problem, it seems, maybe connecting. He's a bit wooden when he performs. What would you do if you were Keir Starmer, Matthew Goodwin?
Yeah, I mean, I met Keir Starmer a number of times. I've done a few events with him. I think he's a really nice guy. I think he's intelligent. And it's what I say is not personal, but he's not going to win an election. He's going to go down as potentially a Michael Howard for the Labour Party, a stabiliser who perhaps cleared the way for somebody else. Here's the reality, Chris. For the Labour Party to win a majority in the next election, they've got to do better than Clement Attlee did in 1945. They've got to do better than Tony Blair did in 1997. They've got to win about 125 seats. And they've got to do that while winning back England, where they haven't won the popular vote since 2001. They're stacking votes in places where they don't need votes, and they're losing votes in places where they need votes. And this is fundamentally a problem of geography, but also a problem of ideology. I don't think many voters really know what Keir Starmer really believes, what he feels, what he's passionate about.
But it's so hard, though, to break out, because he's been tied to a Zoom call since becoming leader in April last year, hasn't he? I mean, and therefore, who can know what he stands for, given he can't even... do you not think maybe he needs a big fight with the left to demonstrate why he's different to Jeremy Corbyn? He hasn't had that fight yet. He might have it this September at the Labour conference. But by those battles with the left, that might define who he is. But he hasn't had that chance to make that fight.
Chris, I push back a little bit against that, because I think the last year... we've basically been sat at home, watching the news on lockdown. We've never been more exposed to our politicians. We've seen them on the news. We've seen them at question time. And throughout all of that, actually, Starmer's personal ratings have got worse. They've not improved. And I think that does reflect the simple reality that there is a lack of charisma. There is a lack of spark. There isn't that Blair factor. There isn't that Boris factor. I think we all know that. We might as well just say it. And I think then moving on from that, the question is, okay, well, how does Labour stabilise? I think what he needs to do is much more than a reshuffle of the front bench. He needs new ideas. He needs a new manifesto. He needs to try and reorientate the conversation so it's back into many of those heartlands.
He's gone there with this new advisor. Deborah Mattinson is the head of strategy. Now, she, Britain Thinks, has done some work. She likens him to an eagle when she talks to voters in the red wall areas, which means he hovers about and doesn't engage and just watches everything with a cool eye. Perhaps that's the answer. I mean, perhaps he's making the effort to try and work out what people want. But the fact he has to make those connections with pollsters rather than knowing what to do himself is quite telling.
Yeah, but Chris, I don't think Labour need an eagle right now. I think they need a bull in a china shop. They need somebody who's going to fundamentally shake up the relationship between the country and the Labour Party. Yeah. Whole new ideas, new people.
You've appointed Rachel Reeves to be Shadow Chancellor. That's a good one, because she's a good performer and she'll make a good case when the next budget comes round in November. It was a limited reshuffle, wasn't it? Often Labour reshuffles are limited because they can't sack people who have been elected by members, which is the case for Angela Rayner.
Well, I think the point about the reshuffle as well is, somebody made the joke about shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic. And I think actually, in a way, there is an aspect of truth to that. I think here's the thing, Chris, that I always find remarkable about the debate in Britain. We do focus very strongly on us, right? We focus very strongly on what's happening in Britain. But the simple fact is centre-left social democratic parties have reached record lows across almost every European state. There is a fundamental problem at the moment with social democracy that is simply not suited to the times that we are in. And I think that's the deeper existential question facing Keir Starmer. This challenge is existential. It's not just strategic.
Can I ask quickly, you said there that Labour has to win 125 seats at the next election. Can you explain why that is? Surely they've got to reverse 40 seats to clear the Tory majority, or what am I missing there?
Well, I'm talking about if Labour are to win a majority overall. Now, they could certainly create a pathway to power that runs through some kind of progressive alliance. So there could potentially be some sort of hookup with the SNP, Lib Dems and Greens. Don't forget, Chris, we've also got to take into account boundary changes and the way in which the landscape is going to change. And fundamentally, this is what struck me yesterday looking at the coverage of the elections. Everybody's saying, well, what about London? What about Liverpool? Labour already control those areas. Labour already control those areas at general election. They've got to reach out. And because Hartlepool has gone, Chris, I think there are now about 24 seats, Labour seats, hanging by a thread, what I would call the Red Wall 2.0, where you may begin to see seats like those in Barnsley, even maybe Yvette Cooper's seat. Very small majorities, 1,000 or so, they could easily fall at the next general elections. So even if Labour do better in the south and they reach into the commuter belt where there are graduates and liberals and so on, they might simultaneously lose more of the Red Wall.
OK, well, moving on to the Conservative Party, had a very good weekend, didn't they? Would you argue that Boris Johnson has learnt the lesson of Nigel Farage?
Well,
discuss.
They're certainly very different politicians and I think very different men. There is a sense of similarity between them in that they both are oozing charisma in different ways, and they certainly appear to have a remarkable connection with a large portion of the country. But overall, I do think that they've struck on this formula of leaning a little bit left on the economy, talking to these left behind regions, and then leaning a bit more on culture.
Professor Matthew Goodwin there, and thank you for his time. You wouldn't have thought it, would you? A few weeks ago, Boris Johnson's government was beset by sleaze, by concerns about his wallpaper, about the Green Seal saga and the government's response to that. And now, just a few weeks later, he's king of all he surveys. But can he be king of the union? Can he help hold that all together? To answer that question, I brought on Lucy Fisher, the Telegraph's deputy political editor. Lucy Fisher, the Telegraph's deputy political editor, welcome to Choppers Politics once again. Now, reflecting on the weekend's results in Scotland, where's it left the union, do you think?
Well, the government will be happy in one sense that Nicola Sturgeon and the pro-independence movement, the SNP, did not receive a majority, 1 seat short of that magic 65-seat figure needed for her to claim that she herself and her party had a majority for independence. However, of course, when you put the SNP together, their 64 seats with the Green Party's 8 seats, there is a majority overall in Holyrood for independence. So that does leave Boris Johnson in a difficult position as he looks ahead to the union, and it will increasingly be a priority of his administration now that the pandemic is receding from being a pandemic in the pure sense to a seasonal illness that he's got to deal with and a recovery effort that he needs to pay attention to.
Let's start with the SNP. What will the SNP do next, do you think?
Well, Nicola Sturgeon herself has shown a degree of caution. She has said that the pandemic recovery has got to be the priority in the short term. But it remains to be seen how much pressure she comes under from the staunch hardliners, both in her party and the wider independence movement, to move quickly. In one sense, she will be breathing a sigh of relief this week that Alex Salmond's Alba party failed to win any seats. He had pledged to put down a motion immediately seeking to get the ball rolling on an independence referendum. But clearly, she sees her best chance of success in being a referendum held in 2023, which would need for legislation to be getting underway next year, but giving her a bit of manoeuvre room this year. That's lucky for the government because that gives Boris Johnson the manoeuvre room himself to start with this sort of love bomb approach that I know you've written a lot about, Chris. All the tactics, the strategy for keeping the union together, burnishing those ties that bind the 4 constituent nations, and of course, a key component of all this, doling out a lot of cash to Scotland to deal with its NHS backlog, rail and road links, burnishing infrastructure and transport, and even sort of innovative ideas about using the Turing, the new successor to the Erasmus scheme, to, for example, have exchanges between students in each of the 4 parts of the UK.
More money for Scotland, given how well they do anyway from the Barnett formula. I mean, this won't go down well with people maybe in the north of England who might feel they want the cash. I mean, they're getting a lot of focus, aren't they, in the north? But maybe they think, why are the Scots getting even more to avoid them wanting to vote to leave the union?
Well, I think you identify a really key issue there, that this is liable to spark a lot of resentment in England and potentially fan the flames of English nationalism, that sense that more money than is fair per capita is going to Scotland. I think that is an issue that Boris Johnson will have to contend with in the months ahead.
I was struck by the letter which Boris Johnson wrote to Nicola Sturgeon on Sunday. He asked them to a summit of the Union, didn't he, with Mark Drakeford and the Northern Ireland First Ministers. In the letter, though, Johnson said at the end that he wants to work with them to build back better, which I thought gave away what the letter could be seen as, which may be a stunt, a political stunt. I mean, those terms, build back better, are government Tory slogans. And why would you use that language in a letter to Nicola Sturgeon if it wasn't to try and wind her up?
Well, that's a very astute reading of it. And clearly that's the take that Sturgeon herself had, as she sort of called it, a clever manoeuvre on Boris Johnson's part. I mean, on the face of it, look, we've got this huge impact on education from the pandemic, courts backlog, more than 4.7 million people across the country on the waiting lists for healthcare treatment that's been delayed. So on the face of it, it is a justifiable idea for Boris Johnson to say, let's work together to help recover from the pandemic. But clearly, Nicola Sturgeon has seen the dangers to herself, and particularly around the devolved areas of Holyrood, which include health. She doesn't want to be locked into that UK-wide effort that could see Boris Johnson take the credit for any successes.
For how long can the Tories say, no, Nicola Sturgeon, you can't have this referendum you promised in your manifesto?
Well, it's a good question how long this not now approach can continue. I think if the argument is made that we need to see recovery from the pandemic, potentially it could be years before we get back to an even keel to the pre-pandemic level, recovering from many of the areas in which the pandemic has wrought devastation across civic society and public services. On the other hand, I think it remains to be seen what public opinion does in Scotland. Internal Downing Street opinion polls have showed that there is not an immediate clamour for a second independence referendum poll in Scotland. But what does tend to rile Scottish voters is being told, no, you're not allowed one. So I think that that's what we'll see the British Westminster government trying to toe a very careful line on now. And what we've seen kind of from the rhetoric coming from Michael Gove, this idea of Scottish voters are entitled to have their say in a legal referendum, but not now. I think that is the line that they will push as far as they can in the years ahead.
And the same debate might play out that we saw with Nigel Farage against David Cameron, and eventually leading to, of course, the 2016 referendum. As Boris Johnson, as somebody who fought to leave the European Union, it's quite hard to tell the Scots you can't have a vote to sort out your own self-determination.
Well, I think that's right, and that's why he will not be saying, no, you can't. It will just be a continuous, no, not now. But I think also, you make a good point, Boris Johnson has seen what happened to David Cameron in the wake of that EU referendum. It ended Cameron's premiership.
Badly.
Very badly. It destroyed his legacy in many ways. It is, all he was remembered for. And in history, 100 years hence, when the Greensill scandal fades into distant memory, it will be that. It will be taking Britain out of the EU that Cameron is remembered for. So I think that Boris Johnson will be very aware of that and will be doubly determined not to be the Prime Minister that ends up seeing the breakup of the Union.
Elsewhere, of course, a good weekend for Boris Johnson. I'm struck by this week is Greensill week. We've got Lex Greensill giving evidence into the Commons today, David Cameron on Thursday. But the Greensill saga is almost like it happened in a different universe, not just literally 3 weeks ago when it was all over the news. When I went to Hartlepool, I was struck by how little people were talking about any of this sleaze agenda, which was being pushed by the Labour Party and written about in a lot of newspapers. He really has, with one bound, he's free, isn't it, Boris Johnson? He's a slippery political fish to try and get a handle on, isn't he, for his opponents?
Well, I think that's right. It is extraordinary, given the Conservatives' historic win in Hartlepool, the first time they've taken the seat since its modern creation in 1974, picking up more than 200-odd councillors across England, a slew of other councils coming under Conservative control. Even Sean Bailey, the Tory candidate in London, often characterised as Labour's strongest bastion, doing far better than expected, really does show that the sleaze narrative has not cut through. And therefore, I think Boris Johnson will be breathing a sigh of relief and not too bothered about whatever horrors Greensill and Cameron have in store later this week.
Why do you think that is? Why does sleaze not stick to Boris Johnson?
Well, it's often said, isn't it, that it's scruples people find off-putting, far from the opposite. And I think perhaps people find it a humanising aspect of Boris Johnson's character. I think people view it as akin to cutting corners and being a bit disorganised. It goes along with his ruffled hair and skew-whiff tie. I don't think it has captured the public imagination as a key matter of dishonesty as such. It just doesn't seem to be what people are bothered about compared to what the Conservatives are offering.
And just elsewhere, while we're on Lucy Fisher, the independents withered away. Lawrence Fox got 1.9% in London, although quite a high-profile campaign. The Greens did well. That's interesting. I think back to the Euro elections in the late 80s when Margaret Thatcher was very stung by the performance of the Greens in those. And that led to her becoming quite an environmentalist. Often not remember this, but she was really keen on the environment. I think the Tories are luckily ahead of that, aren't they, because of the COP conference coming up in November.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that this is something that clearly has been high profile under Boris Johnson, not least because his fiancée, Carrie Symonds, is a very sort of staunch animal welfare campaigner and green champion.
That link, Lucy Fisher, is not accepted by Number 10, of course. That's assumed by people watching what's happening. But
I think it's factual that she is a champion of those things. Of course, there are others.
Any effect on government policy is not accepted by the Number 10.
Well, that is true. They would deny that she is having any undue influence. But of course, it did begin before Boris Johnson administration. We saw with David Cameron, the Huskies, the Green Agenda, vote blue to go green. It has been a longer term evolution of the Conservatives, and one of the key ways in which they have evolved from and countered attacks on them as the nasty party, showing that they care about the environment, they care about future generations. It has been a longer term evolution. And interestingly, the Green Party, the way that vote has held up and in some parts of the country made gains, just goes to show how splintered the vote on the left is. It's something that was not as much talked about under Jeremy Corbyn, but his ability to bring in the Greens and really shore up the left flank of the Labour Party is something perhaps Keir Starmer is not so able to do. And that is increasingly a problem for him, as we've seen, as you pointed out, the collapse of UKIP, the collapse of the Brexit Party has seen in this latest round of local elections a consolidation of the right-wing vote under the Conservative Party that has seen them do so well.
Don't you think, standing back, Lucy Fisher, just finally, the results from the weekend, to me, just show that we are now looking at 10 years of Boris Johnson in Number 10 Downing Street. I mean, that is surely something which you can't deny. It is going to be 10 years of Boris Johnson. His critics won't like it, but that's what's going to happen.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And indeed, even before this weekend, when you look at his majority, an 80-seat majority in the Commons, for any Labour leader to make even a decent dent in that, let alone overcome it, to seek their own majority or even a coalition Labour-led government was looking like a tall order. But clearly the voters are liking what they see. Boris Johnson's pledge to level up the country seems to be having effects in the North and Midlands, where we saw the Conservatives pick up seats in places like council seats in places like Sunderland, in Redditch, in Nuneaton. So, yeah, I think that there will be real celebrations continuing in the Conservative Party in Downing Street this week as they plan for a decade in government.
Lucy Fisher, our Deputy Political Editor, thank you so much for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
And you can read more of Lucy's work by clicking on the link in the show notes of this episode. And if you're not already a Telegraph subscriber, and why not, you can get 30 days free access to our best Telegraph content online by going to telegraph.co.uk/chopper. Well, that's all for this week, listeners. If you want to suggest a topic or a guest, please do email us. We're at chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or find us on Twitter. We're at chopperspodcast. Or please do write a review on Apple Podcasts. Give us 5 stars. Go on, why not? Writing reviews really helps other people find this show. Thank you to my guests this week, Khalid Mahmood, Matthew Goodwin, and of course, Lucy Fisher. Thank you to my producers, Louisa Wells, Elliot Lampitt, and Theo Luludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. And finally, if you can, please do buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph, available at all good newsagents. Until next time, though, cheerio!